your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my fabulous co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
You know, normal people stuff, just super gluing my shoe back together.
Is there a story there?
My shoe just disintegrated. And these are my trusty Sperry's, which are a godsend, pardon the turn of phrase there, for...
You mean science send?
Yes,
Come on.
A Dawkins
Get your
send.
shit together, Ari.
Know, Dawkins is the atheist god. Because they're androgynous, and they also come in size 3, because I have the teeniest feetsies ever, other than Lucinda. So these shoes I've worn every day to work for the past 3 years, and then they're just falling apart. So I have to super glue them back together, and I ordered another identical pair that's not going to be here till next week, and I don't want people to be looking at my sock for the next 5 days at work, which is probably what's going to happen if this super glue doesn't work.
Moment of silence for Ari's tiny shoes.
Oh, yes, it is.
First up this week, let's talk Obamacare. The Republican health care bill passed the House and made its way out to the Senate last week, and lots of people are scared out of their minds for very obvious and justifiable reasons. We'd like to take some time to sift through the mess here. There are lots of really good reasons to be scared and pissed off, but I've also seen a lot of misinformation floating around out there, and I think it's a good idea to work through what's fact and what's fiction about the law. The American Health Care Act, as it's jokingly called, is not exactly the wet dream of every conservative Republican, which is why it already failed once and will most likely die in the Senate this time around. It's still pretty terrible, though. The Congressional Budget Office hasn't rated the newest version of the bill yet, but under the previous version, they estimated that 24 million people would lose their insurance coverage by 2026. First, let's talk about the law. And for details, we're going to go to the official Atheist Manifesto legal correspondent, Andrew Torrez of the Opening Arguments podcast. Welcome, sir.
Callie, Ari, thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Very welcome.
On the
Very
podcast.
welcome. So could you just kind of give me a broad overview? What's in the bill?
This bill is essentially the same AHCA that failed, or that would not have passed the House before because it did not have the votes of the Freedom Caucus, the most extreme right-wing section of the Congress, with a few concessions in for the Freedom Caucus. So if you were not a fan of the bill the last time, you should not be a fan of the bill this time. It's pretty terrible in almost every way, and there is a reason why this bill was rapidly rammed through prior to getting scoring from the Congressional Budget Office. And the reason for that is because this bill has in its predicate that it provides for a reconciliation. And let me do a tiny bit of law geekery here. In the Senate, if a bill is revenue neutral and can be reconciled with a revenue neutral identical act that is passed by the House, then you can avoid the filibuster, right? So you can pass it with 51 votes instead of with 60 votes. Now, this bill is nowhere near revenue neutral, right? Like, it is shockingly revenue adjusting in terms of the tax cuts that it contains, repealing the surtax on individuals making $250,000 a year or more, and when it is ultimately scored by the CBO, that will take it out of the reconciliation process.
So there's been a lot of talk about the changes in coverage for pre-existing conditions. I think that's the thing that people are freaking out the most about. And so under Obamacare, it was illegal for, or is still, thankfully, illegal for insurance companies to charge more or deny coverage for pre-existing conditions. And if this law were to pass in its current form, what would that change?
This law contains in sort of classic Orwellian fashion, a provision that says nothing in this law should be construed as denying, quote, access to health insurance for individuals with pre-existing conditions.
And because they say that, it makes it true, right?
Well, the word access means the ability to purchase, right? And so what this bill does is takes individuals with pre-existing conditions and it puts them into high-risk pools. And then those high-risk pools have kind of three features to them, right? So the first is part of the way insurance works is by spreading risks among large populations, right? So if you have a population that has a couple of high-risk individuals in it, but lots and lots of people who are sort of low risk, then you spread the costs from a couple of people out across the entire population. And that was the whole idea of Obamacare, right? Which is to say, the mandate that requires people who are in their 20s and 30s who, by and large are pretty healthy, who, even if you're like, look, if you're 28, like you can be really, really unhealthy and still not be a good bet to die in the next 10 years, right? And if you're 80, you can be, you can run triathlons when you're 80 and your life expectancy is still, 87, 88, right? Like, so the first thing about high risk pools is they exempt out all the people that bring down the costs by spreading those risks out among a larger population. Right. The second thing is, and this is going to be an escalating order of this is why you should panic. Right. So the first thing is there's no reason for these high risk pools to be able to bring down costs because everybody who's being insured is in the same, quote, high risk category. So there's nothing to bring down the costs. The second thing is there's nothing in the bill that requires even though you have to take people with pre-existing conditions, there's nothing in the bill that requires you as an insurer to cover those pre-existing conditions, right?
Right. So it's not necessarily that they're going to say, well, we're not going to cover you, but they'll say, we'll cover you except for these things.
Except for that, right? Like, which was exactly the state of the law prior to Obamacare, right? It was to say, like, okay, we know you have condition X, so we're going to write as an exclusion to this policy any complications that arise from condition X, right? And if that's a congenital condition, right, like if that's something you're born with, they can say, yeah, like, no, the reason you want health care is the thing we're not going to pay for. So that's a really bad thing. And then the third thing that this bill does with respect to the high-risk pools is there's no cap on what they charge for premiums. Like literally there is no cap. So you put that all together and the bill says we protect access to insurance for individuals with pre-existing condition. And that access means we can force you into a high-risk pool with no cap on your premiums and no requirement for what they must cover, and good luck. And that is like there have been, right, there are some, my co-host Thomas has put out, there are two things. Number one, I want you to look at his video that he's put out on this, which I will send to you, and I hope you'll link because it's awesome. But number two, right, like he said, look, there's some liberal hysteria on this about like the bill makes rape a pre-existing condition. And like, and I agree with Thomas that like, look, this bill is bad enough and it's really, really bad. Right. And it is bad enough that we don't need to engage in hyperbole to describe how bad the bill is, right? What we need to do is communicate very clearly to our elected representatives. This bill essentially guts the protections for pre-existing conditions. And if you pass it, millions of Americans will effectively be denied health care coverage and will die, right? Like that's not an exaggeration. That's not a mischaracterization. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. And
it sets up a system that's almost one of the problems that's still with Obamacare, because they can say like, well, these people are covered, but there's all these asterisks that you never hear about. Like I saw somebody saying like, well, sure, I technically have insurance, but my copays are so high I can't ever get treated for anything. But those people are still counted as covered, so they're counted as an Obamacare success story. And I could see the same thing happening with this bill, because they could say like, well, all of these chronically ill people, they have insurance, and they just conveniently leave out the part that their chronic illness isn't covered by the quote unquote insurance they have.
Yeah, and look, that was one of the loopholes that Obamacare tried to close. And like, it wasn't 100% successful, but it was very, very successful in eliminating insurance plans that were targeted at people in their 20s and 30s that provided almost no coverage. They were super cheap, right? But they provided almost no coverage. And, and so one of the like right-wing talking points, I know you've seen this, of the, Obama off the cuff saying, if you like your doctor, you'll be able to keep it. Well, there were a small percentage of cases where people were in terrible health care plans and didn't know it. And Obamacare eliminated those sort of sham health care plans. And so, so it wasn't technically correct. It was a bad tactical political reason, a bad tactical political mistake, I should say. But nevertheless, it's good public policy to say we don't want people in their 20s and 30s just essentially writing checks to insurance companies in a way that you couldn't possibly ever make up for the value of the checks that you were writing, right? So, yeah, it's like those are the things we should be stopping, not encouraging.
Right. In speaking of the hysteria you talked about earlier, I've seen these lists of conditions that are being circulated. Like, these are the things that the bill makes a pre-existing condition. And are those real?
No, they're not. Right. And again, it's why it's frustrating, because the facts of the bill are bad enough as they stand. Right. Like, we don't need and what I would do sometimes when you're talking about public policy, right, like you want to say, right, the end result of X policy is Y. Right. So I don't my heart is with the people who are making these kinds of, videos and lists and memes and that sort of thing. But in this case, right, like, you don't want to get called out for misrepresenting what the bill says, right? And you don't want to walk into the trap that the House Republicans wrote, right? If you say this bill eliminates protections for people with pre-existing conditions, but, you go on Fox News, you encounter one of these, brains of a mushroom Trump talking head people, and you say this bill guts the protections for people with pre-existing conditions, they will say, well, no, look, let me read you right from the bill, like, quote, blah, 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 nothing in this bill is designed to deny access to health care. So you need to come out and make the argument that anticipates their response, right? You need to come out and say, look, this bill has sham protections for people with pre-existing conditions. It gives them lip service, but then it sticks them into these high-risk pools that have no caps on the premiums and no requirements for coverage. And then their response on Fox News is, right? Like, there's nothing they can say in response, because that's the truth. That's what the bill covers. And if you make these attenuated arguments, then you get bogged down in, right, you walk into what the right wants on this, right, which is they want to say, well, that's the view that you get on MSNBC and fake news, and our view that we get on Fox News says this, and so, who knows what the truth really is? Well, we know what the truth really is. We can look at the text of the bill, and it's why I feel strongly about that.
And I think looking at those lists, I'm fairly certain where those lists came from is that those are things that insurance companies considered pre-existing conditions before, right? So it's not like people are just pulling this out of their ass. What they're saying is they're saying that, well, this bill takes things back to status quo the way that it was before Obamacare. Therefore, all of these things that used to be considered pre-existing conditions that can mean you don't get insurance, that's what these things will be. So it's one of those things where I don't think anyone is outright lying or creating hysteria for no reason. I think it's a lack of nuance and a lack of explaining, like, well, this is where that list comes from. Because I have a feeling this is one of those internet things where someone posted a blog like, hey, you know what? Here's the list of all all the things that Anthem considered pre-existing conditions before Obamacare that they would deny coverage for, and someone else took that and said, well, yeah, that's what this bill makes, pre-existing conditions, right? So it makes things complicated. So last question on this one. I know you're not a psychic. We're not expecting you to predict the future, but I'm going to ask you to predict the future. Do you have any thoughts on how likely this bill, or something even similar to it, is going to be passed?
The answer there is, do you think the Senate will change the rules and get rid of the filibuster in its entirety? Because that's where we are with respect to this. There is no way that this bill is going to get 60 votes, right? It is very likely, and for reasons that I could get into, but that largely deal with the fact that Republican senators are more afraid of losing their base than they are of losing a general election, particularly the way the map aligns in 2018. It is very likely it will get at least 50 of 52 Republican votes, right? Like, there was a list circulating on Politico of the, Republican senators you need to watch. And that list included, Ted Cruz, right? Like, Cruz thinks this doesn't go far enough, right? And look, if it has 49 votes, Ted Cruz will give this thing 50 votes, right? So the question is 50 votes going to be enough? And the way that 50 votes can be enough is either, number one, if you pass this through reconciliation, which you can't do, right? This is not revenue neutral. Or number two, if they get rid of the filibuster. So whatever odds you put on the Republican Senate getting rid of 230 years of Senate procedure is the odds that I would put on this bill passing. And sadly, like, I'd love to say the odds on that are 0 or 5% or 10%, but I think they're higher than that. It really worries me.
Is there a certain date that they're set to vote on this, or is it just kind of whenever they get to it? I understand that that's kind of how the Congress tends to work sometimes. It's just like, well, here's the next thing. Let's do it. That's
a great segue to sort of like, here's how a filibuster works, right? Like, the reason why things can pass the House of Representatives on a, 216 to 215 vote, right, is because everything in the House, when you introduce a piece of legislation, it has a fixed time for debate attached to it, right? And so you get 10 total hours per side, in favor and in opposition. And at the end of that, you call a vote. In the Senate, what you do is every piece of legislation that comes up in the Senate has no fixed time for how long you get to debate it. Right. And there's a rule in the Senate that goes back to literally the end of the 18th century that says, in order to cut off debate, you call for what's called a motion for cloture. And that motion for cloture, by historical reasoning, has required 60 votes. Right. So what happens when you have a filibuster is the majority who wants to pass a piece of legislation says, okay, it's time for us to stop debating this and vote up or down. And the minority says, no, you know what? We want to keep debating this. We're going to vote against cloture. And so even if they would lose, if it got to an up or down vote, you sort of postpone indefinitely that up or down vote by saying we're not going to vote for cloture. When the Senate approved Neil Gorsuch, they invoked a procedure, right? It was called the nuclear option, that abolished that portion of the rule with respect to Supreme Court justice nominees, right? So they said, we no longer think you need 60 votes to cut off debate when we're talking about approving a Supreme Court nominee. And that's how Neil Gorsuch made it onto the Supreme Court, despite only having 54 votes, or possibly 55. Like, there were 2 or 3 Democrats that were going to vote for Gorsuch. And the question is the Senate going to blow that up for everything? And again, like it's hard to overstate how radical a position that is, right? Like this has been the rule in the Senate for literally 220 years. And it could go by the wayside. So the answer to your question, Ari, is no, there's not a set time on the docket. And in fact, like the fact that there's not a set time that's what makes this possible for the minority to sort of hold out and say, no, we want to keep debating this. We don't want to bring this to a final vote.
Very cool. Well, Andrew, as always, we appreciate your knowledge, my friend. Thank you for hanging out with us and explaining this all to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's that time once again where we beg you for your hard-earned money. Subverting all that is good and decent about American society is, as I'm sure you know, a pretty tough gig. Katie, Johan Gruss, and Stara understand this better than most. They stepped up this week to do their part to advance the radical gay agenda. This week, their money will go towards building the most massive Disney karaoke library you've ever seen, for when we gays take over and Disney karaoke becomes a mandatory thing. Check out patreon.com/The Manifesto to make a per-episode donation to support what we do and get access to audio content you won't find anywhere else. Thanks, friends. One quick announcement before we get back to the show. Friday, July 14th is the Inciting Incident 100th episode live special event. Ari and I will be there along with the Scathing Atheist and GAM guys, Andrew Torrez, Chris Cluey, and more. Check out facebook.com/Inciting Incident Podcast for more info and come hang out if you can. Welcome back to the show. So there was something else kind of terrible that happened last week. I think probably slightly less terrible, but still kind of scary. So there was an executive order signed by the person who I refuse to call the president because reasons, that was sort of nebulously aimed at bolstering religious freedom, which is just, I don't even know what I don't even know what these things mean anymore, to be completely honest with you.
That's never a good sign, though. Whenever you hear something is like, oh, religious freedom, it's like, yeah, that's a sign not to like it, probably.
Right. And so this was widely expected to be the executive order that rescinded all of the executive order federal protections for LGBT contractors and employees and, the license to discriminate and all that. And thankfully, it turned out to not be that terrible. And the focus of the executive order largely was on reconsidering the Johnson Amendment. And I know what the Johnson Amendment is, but I probably would not do as eloquent a job at explaining it as our guest, once again, in the same show, Andrew Torrez from the Opening Arguments podcast. Welcome back, sir.
Well, thanks for having me back. It was lonely while I was gone in the middle, but I appreciate being welcomed back.
I know. It's been literally 30 seconds since we talked, and I know it's...
We miss you so
Stop
much.
telling them that. They were supposed to think I sat in silence for 20 minutes while you did other stuff.
Oh, well, this is going to be the second segment of the show, so...
Oh, okay. Well, then I guess they weren't. All right. Man,
so, Andrew, tell us what the Johnson Amendment is. Give us an overview.
Sure. So the Johnson Amendment is it's a section of the U.S. Code, which is 26 U.S.C. 501 and the subsections. And if you have ever heard of a tax-exempt organization, right, you've heard of a 501c3 tax-exempt organization or 501c4, right? And there are like 12 provisions in the code. And that actually refers to the specific section of the law, right? So 26 U.S.C. 501c3 specifically says the following organizations are referred to in subsection A, and that is they're exempt from taxation. And then 3 says corporations and any community, chest, fund, or foundation organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports competition, but only if no part of its activities involve the provision of athletic facilities or equipment, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals, no part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual.
Jesus Christ, Andrew, I'm exhausted.
Sorry.
Something about sports and animal welfare.
Just a reminder that like this law stuff can be hard, right? So if you're a private organization, you can apply for 501c3 status. And 501c3 status is the thing you want to get because it gives you a double benefit, right? And that double benefit is your income that you earn from any source is tax exempt, right? You don't have to pay taxes on it. And donations to your organization are tax deductible. So you get it coming and going, right? And in particular, churches get preferential treatment at the head of the line for that, right? So in that like long list of legalese gibberish that I read to you, the first thing was corporations, any community church, blah, 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 organized for religious, right, purposes. And if you're a religion, historically, the IRS is just like, okay, well, prove you're a church, therefore you're a 501c3, right? If you are a charitable organization, you have to jump through more hoops, and the IRS monitors that a lot more rigorously. So 501c3 organizations get super double bonus plus protection under the tax code, right? And Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the Senate, in the 1950s, future president Lyndon Johnson, passed an amendment. And he said basically like, look, if you're a 501c3, you get this double bonus under the tax code. So what we don't want is to effectively allow people who are representing organizations that pay neither coming nor going, right? Their income is tax-free, and all donations to them are tax deductible. Well, if those organizations could start lobbying for changes in the tax code, then we could wind up on the end of a like crazy ass spiral, right? Like it would just be more money would pump into them and they would argue for more changes to the tax codes that benefit that. Right? So Lyndon Johnson said, you know what? We're going to amend this 501c3 section. And this is what he added. He said, no substantial part of the activities of which, that is the organization, is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, except as otherwise provided in this subsection, doesn't matter, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, right? So it's pretty clear. It says, look, you're a 501c3. You got to keep your nose out of politics for the very, very obvious reason that we've given you an enormous benefit and we don't want you to take more. Right. And that's the Johnson Amendment.
Well, and I think the worry there, too, is that would make it, for example, if a church was able to do political activities, that would mean that people can donate tax deductibly to political organizations. And so that would just give them an outsized influence over people who didn't have that. Advantage. And my understanding, too, is at the time this was passed, it was completely uncontroversial.
Oh, yeah. No, it passed 98 to nothing, right, in the Senate. And let me be really, 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 really clear. If you follow Planned Parenthood on Twitter, which I do, their Twitter handle is @PPACT. And what you are really following is not Planned Parenthood International, the 501c3 organization that provides women's healthcare services, but you are following Planned Parenthood Action, which is a 501c4 tax-exempt organization that lobbies on behalf of candidates and laws and participates in all the stuff that you see Planned Parenthood do. And the only difference between a C3 and a C4 is that your contributions to a C4 organization, and parenthetically, C4 just literally means it's the next section of the code, right? Like it just means you read down one line. The only difference between the C3 and a C4 is that contributions to a C4 are not tax exempt, right? So I support Planned Parenthood Action with my money, but I can't deduct that from my taxes, right? And that's the only difference. And that is literally what this fight is being fought over. So let me sort of put it all together. Churches are very, very butthurt that they can't directly endorse candidates. Okay.
Is that the legal term for that?
Yes, it is. And so what they do is they organize. There are these things called Pulpit Freedom Sundays, right, in which pastors of megachurches videotape themselves explicitly endorsing candidates and then send those tapes to the IRS. And they get together and they all do this, right? And they sort of say, we dare you to come after us and revoke our 501c3 status. Now, this is perhaps the worst, the biggest level of discrimination in the IRS today. And I mean this with 100% sincerity, right? Like, one of the things I do in my day job as a real lawyer is I help legitimately honest charitable foundations apply for 501c3 status. And I distribute to them, when we go through the process, a 5-page memo that I wrote that says, every year you will come under scrutiny. Make sure you don't do the following. And it's a 5-page list of, don't get involved in political campaigns. Don't make statements on behalf of or in opposition, right? Like, you go through this huge rigmarole, because if you are not a church and you are a 501c3 and you dip your toe into the political arena, the IRS will come down on you like a ton of bricks. And I have seen it happen. I have had clients who have had their 501c3 status denied by the IRS or revoked after having previously been granted on the basis of really, really attenuated statements to political campaigns or on behalf of various, issues. But if you're a church, the IRS, and the reason the IRS does this, they don't care, is the chair that was in charge of doing that same level of scrutiny for churches sat vacant for 23 years, right? Literally, there was nobody appointed to fill it. And so the IRS was like, well, you know what? Like, we got all these videotapes coming in. We have evidence of people saying, hi, I'm a church and I'm violating this provision of the law, and we're going to do nothing. And so it's a tremendously unequal position in the law. If you are a church, you get to flaunt it. If you are not, they look at it with sort of exact.
Yeah, I was reading about this earlier, and I remember hearing something about there were like 2,000 people, or like 2,000 pastors or churches who have blatantly done this. Literally two were audited, and no one was punished in any way. There was never any action taken. So it's not just one of those things that's poorly enforced. It's enforced as if it doesn't exist. And
let me be clear here. I think we're all sort of politically on the same side of the aisle. This is something I don't want to say that the net effect is neutral politically, because I think the religious right is far more organized than the religious left. But this is also something that inner city, predominantly African-American churches do to mobilize voters on behalf of Democratic candidates, right? So it's our side, and I will say that even if you don't join in on that, our side takes advantage of this too. Not as well, not as often, not as much, but they do. But what makes the executive order that was just promulgated so dangerous is the executive order, and this is the Presidential Executive Order Promoting Free Speech and Religious Liberty. And it says the following.
Conservative buzzword, conservative buzzword, conservative buzzword. Like, that's literally what the executive order is. It's the executive order promoting conservative buzzwords.
Right. So this is the middle of Section 2. It says, in particular, the Secretary of the Treasury shall ensure, to the extent permitted by law, that the Department of the Treasury, which is what oversees the IRS, does not take any adverse action against any individual, house of worship, or other religious organization. Okay, so mind you, that's it, right? Against people, churches, or church organizations, on the basis that such individual or organization speaks or has spoken about moral or political issues from a religious perspective, where such speech of similar character has, consistent with law, not ordinarily been treated as participation or intervention in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office by Department of the Treasury. Okay, so you see how insidious that is? That says we're going to take the conduct of the IRS over the past 25 years, and the fact that you haven't gone after these churches is now going to be part of this executive order that directs you not to go after these churches, right? So that, in my view, that's where the harm of this EO comes, right? Like, we know the Johnson Amendment has not been well enforced, but to direct the Treasury and say, you may not enforce this regardless of what happens because we haven't been enforcing it over the past 25 years is, I mean, in my view, it's a really shocking thing to do.
Well, yeah, the part of it that I thought about was, so I'm on the board of a 501c3 in Cincinnati. It's a trans support organization. And there was a news conference that was held in response to this, and sort of the healthcare thing, but mostly the executive order. And I was talking with, the head of the nonprofit, and he was like, listen, you got to be really careful about how you word this. And so it's like, you can speak very specific about this action and the harms of this action, but you can't turn that into Trump is bad. Like, because of these rules. And so what this is doing is basically hamstringing what a nonprofit who does trans advocacy can do, which means that a church has more power than we do at that point. It's terrifying.
100%. I had somebody who runs an atheist nonprofit organization, a pretty well-known one that probably your listeners would recognize, ask me, well, hey, look, if this executive order, because this has been reported as this executive order is, reversing the Johnson Amendment, right, which we've walked through, right? That's not entirely accurate. Yeah. Right. But he said, well, look, if this is overturning the Johnson Amendment, then doesn't that mean we now, as an atheist organization, can get out and endorse candidates? And I said, no, not at all, right? Like, the provision in this order specifically applies only to individuals, religious groups, and houses of worship, and it only protects people who have already gotten the benefit of protection over the past 25 years, right? So again, if you think of government as typically wanting to put protections in for persecuted minorities, for the people who need like, this turns that on its head. This says, yeah, the only people who deserve protection here are the people who are the overwhelming majority religion in this country, who have gotten the overwhelming benefits of the law, and us turning a blind eye to it over the past 25 years.
That makes sense with something that I had read, which is that our friends at the Freedom from Religion Foundation have filed a lawsuit over this, saying that it violates constitutional barriers between government and religion. And if it's the case that it's actually advantaging religious organizations over secular organizations, then I could definitely see what their basis for this lawsuit is. Are you familiar at all with this lawsuit and what it's about and what might come out of it?
Yeah, I am familiar with the FFRF lawsuit. In my view, it is multiply successful. They're seeking a declaratory judgment, right, which is to say, we want the court to tell us that this law, in this case, this executive order, is not valid, and a preliminary injunction preventing that from going into effect. And I will be stunned if that is not successful, at least with respect to Section 2 of the executive order. And that's the provision that we've been talking about, right? There are 6 sections of this executive order, and most of the rest of it, like, while it sounds bad, is just kind of sort of nonsense words, right? So, like Section 1 says, it shall be the policy of the executive branch to vigorously enforce federal laws, robust protections for religious freedom. And, like, I mean, that's just,
we would like to announce that the First Amendment is a thing.
Yeah. And so, so.
Amen.
Right. So that stuff is all likely to stand. But I would be shocked if Section 2 stands. And it is multiply wrong. Number one, it is a severe breach of the separation of powers, right? It is essentially overturning via executive order a provision of the law, right, directing the agency that is entrusted with enforcing the law to not enforce a particular law. And, like, look, if you could do that, if that stands, then there's literally nothing to stop President Trump from being like, yeah, well, I don't want you to, I'm going to direct the Department of I almost said Department of Injustice.
I was just going to say it's a Freudian slip. Is that what we're doing here?
Yeah, something like that. But right, there would literally be nothing to stop President Trump from saying, I'm going to direct the Department of Justice, not to enforce murder laws against white people, right? And I realize that sounds preposterous and extreme, but there's no different. This law says we direct you not to enforce the law as it has not been enforced over the last 25 years, right? You can't do that. And also, right, the Lemon v. Kurtzman test very clearly makes it obvious that this particular executive order is designed to advance religion over non-religion, and that is the first prong of a law or executive order that violates the Establishment Clause. So I think the FFRF takes a lot of difficult cases, so they don't necessarily have a great success ratio, but they do terrific work. And this is a case where I would be stunned if they don't win this case.
So I had heard in the days preceding the signing of this executive order that there was going to be this executive order that was going to have devastating ramifications on the LGBTQ community, that it was going to make it easier for businesses to discriminate against people based on things like sexual orientation and gender identity. And then this happened, and I heard absolutely nothing about anything LGBT related. Is that still a thing? Is there anything in this that has to do with discrimination against LGBT people, or did that just get entirely dropped?
Well, there's nothing in this particular EO about LGBTQ people. But here's what I would say in terms of us not being out of the woods. Only 20 states specifically protect sexual orientation and or gender identity as protected classes in their non-discrimination laws. Now, we just had what I consider to be a landmark case come out of the Ninth Circuit, out of the Seventh Circuit, which was Hively versus Ivy Tech. We did an opening arguments on this. And I would encourage you to read that decision. And obviously I would encourage you to listen to my show, but I know you already listen to my show, so I don't need to tell you that. That essentially read into the law that said discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is discrimination on the basis of sex, right? But I will tell you that is the reason this is a landmark decision is it's the first circuit court case that has come to that view, that all of the other circuits have come to the opposite view, right? Which is to say, they've come to the view that you could write sex discrimination, you could write sexual orientation, you could write gender identity, and if the legislature hasn't done that, then that means it doesn't count. And so in 30 states right now, there is no explicit protection in employment discrimination or in discrimination in places of public accommodation for individuals on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, which means in practical terms, in Mississippi, if your boss says, I don't like the fact that I don't understand what non-binary is, so you're fired, you have no recourse in those states. That's a little bit sort of up in the air, but the difference. I mean, we talked about this last year. The Obama administration issued a directive to the Department of Justice that said we want on a federal level to have a policy that says we construe protections on the basis of gender as being protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and that's been reversed. Right, that was written out by executive order, and so you have no guarantee.
So basically, what it was like before 2 years ago or whatever when Obama did that.
Yeah, it really is.
It's fun being queer in America.
Once again, I feel like we're all better for your time and for your presence, Mr. Torrez. Much, much appreciated.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I love this show. I love the two of you, and this is anytime you want me to come on, I will be happy to be.
Last up this week, an announcement I have been dying to make. I have been working on a thing. I've been working on it for months, and I am unbelievably excited that I can finally announce it to the world. For the last few months, I have been working on a new podcast. Don't worry, Gaithy's Manifesto is not going anywhere anytime in the foreseeable future. But there was another itch I needed to scratch too. The show is called Query. If you've ever heard storytelling shows like This American Life, Snap Judgment, Invisibilia, shows like that, you'll be familiar with the format. Basically, the setup is this. I'm absolutely hooked on telling people stories. And where the Gaithy's Manifesto typically focuses on activism and allyship and problems and solutions and community building and affirmation, and then people's stories in that context, Query is 100% story first. In each episode, I'll find a queer or trans person with a compelling, interesting, tragic, funny, or just plain important story to tell. I shove a mic in their face and give them a space to tell that story. It's not an explicitly atheist show. You'll hear stories of religious, queer, and trans folks on the show. But as with the Gaithy's Manifesto, I will never give a platform to hate or bigotry, of course. So for this last segment of the show today, I'm going to share with you the first part of episode 1. The subject of the episode may sound familiar. His name's John, and he was on the show in our Hope After Faith episode. This first part of the first episode is about his experience growing up Christian and in the closet. Enjoy! I'm Callie Wright, and this is Query. Query is a collection of the stories about the lives of queer and trans people. For this very first episode of Query, I'm actually sort of bending one of my own rules. I want this show to mostly avoid stories that focus on someone being queer or being trans as the story. I want there to be more to it than that. I'm tired of hearing stories on mainstream shows that only want to tell coming out stories or the stories of people figuring out they're queer or trans. I think those stories are important, but we are so much more than that. But in this first episode, I'm kind of doing that. I think in the stories you'll hear today, you'll hear a lot that is familiar about the self-realization and coming out and struggling with the consequences that we can sometimes face. But it comes from a bit of a unique angle that I thought warranted these stories being on the show. On this episode, 2 stories of people facing a conflict between their faith and their identity. How do you deal with the conflicts that arise when people who share your faith believe who you are is an abomination? What happens to your relationships with your family and friends when they find out? First, we meet John. John's 29, he's gay, and he spent most of his life until very recently as a Christian in the closet.
It's hard to remember all the way back to when you were, all the details of when you were 14, but yeah, so I had my first realization of that possibly being a thing or whatever, 14, so 15 years ago. I actually remember all the way back until I was really young, not fitting in well. In general, I had friends and I had a lot of friends or anything like that. And it was more like I always just kind of went along with what all the other boys would do. Like I would have fun, like, playing football and all that kind of stuff. But then like other, like more, subtleties as you got older and kids get more emotionally advanced or whatever. I just noticed that I wasn't emotionally advancing in similar ways as like boys were. I never really knew what to do with it. And I wasn't much about like talking. I wasn't a very open person when I was a kid. There was a guy in our youth group that had come out and I ended up talking a lot about stuff with him. And then really the first realization that that's probably what was going on was him and I started dating somewhat and all this kind of stuff. And then it was a slow build. And then it was kind of like, it was more of I saw him and then out of curiosity asked questions. And then there was kind of like a light bulb moment of like, well, maybe this is why I feel and the way that I feel or whatever. Our church wasn't fully on board with where the church as a whole was.
Like a little more on the progressive side?
Yeah, a little bit, but then there was kind of like a push and pull within the church to where like there was still a good number of people that had issues with it, but then there was enough people that were okay with it to where it was just, well, as long as you don't like, no one just talk about it. Everyone knew, but no one was supposed to like talk about it, it felt like. I remember I spent like a day just spending time with my youth pastor when I was having all these questions. I was just kind of like, well, I'm pretty sure like this is where I'm at. And I don't even remember the discussions that we had, but I remember that it was a day long because it was like, well, everyone is saying that it's wrong, and yet I feel this way. What do I do with it? That's all I really remember about that whole day. I can only guess. I didn't receive the answers that I wanted, and maybe that's why I don't remember it. I don't know, but I did spend a whole day with my youth pastor trying to like determine where, according to him and the church, where I was supposed to be at it, because there was so much like of a divide within our church. Definitely makes you feel like ashamed, even if like it's not the intent, because you are having to like something that feels good and natural and right to you, but then to have to like only be able to do that in the context of like a super hidden way or whatever, it made it harder for me to feel like I fit in, because it would create kind of like a divide. Like when I was around everyone, I was this person, and then when I was just me completely by myself, I was this other person. It developed into me just trying to, I would end up naturally molding to whatever situation I was in. So if I'm around a whole bunch of people that are like into this, particular thing, I'll like make myself into that particular thing. They act this way, then I'll like try and like mimic. It just caused this natural like mimicking that I would do, and I would still like have my personality that would like come out, just fun, goofy and all this kind of stuff. But then like in the way that I interacted with stuff would change according to whoever I was around. And I mean, that actually continued up until this last year when, when I started coming out, and when I was just like, like I'm going to figure out where I'm truly at versus where my surroundings tell me that I should be at in order to like fit in most. I definitely believed that it was wrong all the way up until like a couple years ago, that as far as biblically and all this other stuff and everything, because I grew up in the Methodist church, which they still, like, according to their books and laws and all that stuff, says that, homosexuality is wrong and all that. And it kind of takes the Catholic approach where, like, it's wrong. You can be that as long as you don't live it out, kind of. That's where they're at now. But there's a lot of people that are, like, trying to get that changed because, like, they don't agree. So it was difficult because you would have individuals that were totally okay with it, but then the church as a whole wasn't. So once you got outside of those individuals, you were no longer that. So then I just was like, well, I mean, if this many people think that it's wrong, then it's probably wrong. And so you do end up developing a mindset of like, I need to like battle against this. I need to not embrace it, and I need to like push it away and like hide it. And it's not like anybody told me to do that. I didn't go through like the whole like, whatever the de-gaying like therapy.
Conversion therapy.
Yeah, I didn't go through like conversion therapy. I didn't like none of it was that extreme. So I never really felt like me doing the things that I was doing. I never felt that, hell and brimstone like pressure of just like, oh, I'm gonna like burn for this. I didn't know if I even believed if anyone would or whatever. I never thought about it into that far of a detail because I never had to. For the most part, Methodist is very much about like love and grace and like, they're very unifying message where they like, they would prefer to work with people and like bring them in, like, I don't know, very soft, so I never really experienced the whole like in your face, like you are a sinner and you are going to hell for these things and these things and these things. It got brought up that I was just like, I would just listen to it and like, wow, that person's really intense. And then I just kind of like move on from it. I don't know.
Yeah. And what about school? Because I remember, growing up in school as, someone perceived on the outside to be a boy, like, a lot of those conversations happen where everything's like, oh, that's gay. That's the gayest shit ever. And
school is the biggest reason that I didn't come out. The guy that I dated and there was like one or two gay guys in my high school, and I just watched some of the stuff that like they had to go through from afar and literally just thought like, well, I don't even know for sure because I was trying to like push it away instead of dealing with it. So I'm like, since I don't even know for sure, why would I put myself through that? And just continually hearing the locker room talk that doesn't happen, supposedly. Oh, you're such a fag, and just like fag and gay and all these words were used in such negative connotations. Like, why would I want to associate myself with something so negative, something that is looked down at like that? Like, you remember the hand test thing that they used to do? I don't at my school, they would say, a guy would go up to you and say, look at your fingernails. And if you look at your fingernails like this, then you're gay.
A better description would probably help here. Apparently, when someone asks to look at your fingernails, if your reflex is to flatten your hand completely with your fingers together, you're gay. If you ever wonder why I don't miss high school, there's your answer.
And I remember the first time, all the way back then, the first time, it was like middle school, where some kid asked me that, and I was just like, I don't know. And I look at my hand, like, oh, you're gay. And I'm like, no, I'm not. That immediately set it in such a negative connotation of like, why? And for the longest time, I refused, like, I would only look at my nails like this from that day on, so that I would be sure to like not be seen as that.
For reference, the not gay way to check your nails: face your palm inward and bend your fingers over so they touch the inside of the top of your hand. So if you're trying to go stealth in high school, keep that in mind.
I feel like I just slowly, from like 14, 15, I just slowly spiraled into like being extremely unhappy. And then I totaled my car in like May of 2008. And I remember it happening. It was kind of a shock to my system, and it made me like reevaluate a lot of my life and my stuff and everything like that. And then it actually made me decide, I'm like, well, I need to commit either way, because I was kind of in this limbo of like, well, I am this, but I feel this way. I either need to be the way that I feel, or I need to just commit to being this thing.
This thing being like
the godly straight, like, and really just dig my heels into it and embrace it. And once I do that, then I would be fully like fulfilled and feel in place and all that kind of stuff. And
it's like giving it to God kind of thing. Like,
right.
I hear a lot of people say that, like, if you're really struggling with that, then that may be a sign that your faith isn't strong enough, and that like if you fully give yourself over to God, that He'll take those feelings away from you. Yeah. So did you end up doing that?
Oh yeah, because I spent like the next while, and then around, it was really crazily timed, which is also like, in a Christian context, when things are crazily timed, it's not coincidence, it's not whatever, it's godly ordained and such. And at the time, I totally was on board with that mindset. And that's where I met my soon-to-be ex-wife. We started going to a church that was very, Jesus didn't die on the cross for you to have a beer, and like very much like, these things are sin and you will go to hell if you have anything to do with these things. And very abrasive, hyper spiritual, Pentecostal, very in your face kind of stuff. And that's where I decided, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to, dive in head first from like here on out. For like 6 or 7 years after that, we went from like one church to another church. We were like moving around churches. And as we went, I would like study stuff, in the Bible. And then I'd be like, well, the way that they're doing this just doesn't make sense if you read the Bible this way. And like just genuinely studying it and trying to understand something that had surrounded my life, my whole life up to that point, trying to actually understand it for the first time. And so we moved church to church because we would slowly I'm like, well, I just don't believe enough like they do. So let's like try this church. And then it slowly like divulged to where when we moved out to Iowa and I had a lot of time to myself, I had read what I felt like was everything as far as like within the Christian sphere of trying to figure things out. I started reading stuff outside of that. It made me confront my religious stuff, but then it also made me confront about how I actually felt towards men and all, everything like that, because it was a thing to where I remember being at church having conversations with other guys, and I like to try and give people like decent eye contact when I talk with them, and some people find it awkward, but I don't know, whatever. So, but I would do that, and I would end up like having thoughts pop up of wanting to kiss that guy at that time, and then I'm like, just like, shh,
Right.
go away. Why? And so I finally just owned up to that, and then it was almost like once I opened the door to being okay with that being a reality, it then allowed like me to just go all out, like, oh, I'm going to totally figure out who I am and where I'm at with things, and be more open and honest with myself. And did that like in private to where, once me doing that combined with a whole bunch of other stuff ended my marriage, then that like opened the door towards me being able to completely embrace it. Because I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned from all of it, is that the reason that a lot of people don't come out, or a lot of people don't embrace how they actually truly feel, is because as life has gone on, they've ended up attaching themselves to another person's life. And so you're just naturally, you're continually compromising how you really feel and who you really are with how they really feel and who they really are, so that you can like meet in the middle, or like you can just live coercively with someone else and just like cohesively. And once you take that away, then you can really, and it is like pretty scary and intense to just be like, oh, well, it's all me now after all this time of it not. That's the biggest thing that I've taken from my coming out thing, is that I feel like that's genuinely a lot of people's issues, is that they just have to compromise with their, when you're younger, compromise with how your parents feel and how your family feel and how your friends feel around you. And then whoever you end up, since I was trying to be a straight guy, of course I'm going to get with girls. And then eventually you do something enough to where it starts to feel natural. And so I do have this weird thing to where I still feel that way sometimes, but then that is the unnatural feeling that I have now. And like me being gay is the more natural feeling, whereas before I framed it to where feeling that way towards girls was the natural thing, and like feeling that way towards guys was the unnatural thing. Apparently, it only works for so long before eventually your body's just like, something has to happen.
Was there ever a time where you actually had yourself convinced that you could not be gay if you wanted, like if you tried hard enough, or that you actually weren't?
For the longest time, yeah, it was to where I had successfully shut out those issues, to where I was just like, oh, it was just a thing. It's not, there or whatever. But the only way that I was able to keep that up is if I continued to just let the facade continue and not actually face myself on anything, and just kind of like go with stuff. But then honestly, when I got married, and then her and I were trying to like figure out what all of our issues were, and actually like, well, now that I'm with someone, I do need to figure out my issues. And then once I started facing my own issues, it slowly like cracked that door back open. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that I used to feel this way at one point, and now I feel this way again. And so it did I did block it out for probably, like 6 years. I don't know, 6 or 7 years. I was able to kind of block those feelings and those issues out to a degree. In private, for the longest time, I kind of just let it continue. But then at a certain point, it just kind of stopped because it was so far from where I had made myself. There was a time where I felt like I had been healed of those feelings and those issues. And it was honestly really only once I did get really fully committed into church that those issues started coming back out, because you're supposed to examine your heart, and you're really supposed to do like introspective thinking. Fortunately, I just wasn't very good at doing that just solely in the context of the Bible. I kind of did it within myself, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, well, now there's these things that are in me that don't match up with that. So then it did turn into a journey of am I the wrong one, or is that the wrong one, or are they the wrong one? And
when you got married, was that... I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase this question.
yeah.
Because I think there's not a way to phrase it that makes it not sound awful. But it's a common thing, right? That men who are gay will marry women because... and obviously, I'm sure there are very differing reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are people who genuinely do love each other.
Yeah.
On one level or another, and they get married because that's like what we're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to imagine that some people are doing it to convince themselves that they're straight, even though they know in their heart of hearts they're not.
Yeah.
And that can create some awful situations, especially, when there are kids involved and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious where you were at on that spectrum when you got married.
When I got married, I know for a fact that I got married. I cared about her and I loved her, and I still, do now. But like, I remember feeling like if I could just like make that work, that would make me happy. It was an answer to a void inside of myself, because that's kind of what I was always pursuing, was trying to figure out something to fill that void and make myself feel happy and all that kind of stuff. And I never really understood why it was there. But yeah, I essentially, I didn't do it like in a tactful way of like, oh, she's going to be my, gay beard, or, all those
Right.
kinds of terms where it's just like, they're just hiding it on purpose. Or, I didn't do it because I'm like, well, I want kids, but how is that supposed to work? Blah, blah. I just genuinely was like, I think if I can make things work with her, it'll answer enough of my issues to where I'll be able to be happy. And then it didn't. And so I do feel like because I couldn't be myself, that it caused a lot of struggles with her and I. And then that caused other struggles. And it just got to the point to where in order for me to be able to be who I wanted to be happy, it was going to make her unhappy. And so then we separated. And once we separated, I was like, well, now I can just worry about me. And then that's when I was like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and like check that box off finally, that I probably should have, done myself a favor and just checked it off when I was in high school. It's one of those things where hindsight and everything, where I could look back and be like, even though I would have had more different issues, and I wouldn't say my life would have been easier, but at least I probably would have had a better chance of being happier sooner in my life. Having other people be what make you happy is nothing compared to being able to make yourself happy by actually being you.
How did that conversation go with your wife?
Not well, but it was actually 4th of July when everything really kind of like came to fruition, because throughout our marriage, I did not tell her a lot of who I was previously, because I did have the mindset of my past self is gone. I've been cleansed. So all that stuff's just gone. Like, I genuinely saw it as like, well, I've accepted Jesus. So now I'm cleansed, I'm free, and I'm this new person. So I didn't think about the fact that like practically that doesn't mean that all your past issues just magically just go away. They still need to be dealt with and all this other stuff. So that's what kind of happened throughout our marriage, was that things would happen, and then I would either try and lie about it and like move on, or I would end up just being like, yes, like that is like something that I've done. And part of it was like, it came up at one point that I had dated a guy, and then it came up that I had been with a guy. That's all I really said. And she was just like, okay, well, blah, blah. Because I'd been with other girls before her, and that was an issue. So she was just like, well, that's just kind of one more like issue. And then I was like, okay, but then, I was actually like with a guy, like I was dating him, depending on how you look at virginity, like I had essentially lost my virginity to him. Since that, I'm not sure that I've like felt towards another person the way that I did him back then. All that kind of just came up. Like one question led to another question, led to another question that night. And finally I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to like put it all out there, because I am tired of hurting you by these things slowly coming out, and I'm tired of just like trying to like mitigate my way through it. And so I really just fleshed it all out. At that point, she was just like, okay, well, said something along the lines of like, if that's how you feel, then I can't be who you need me to be because I'm not a guy. So like, it's just not going to work. And and I fought that for a while, and I'm just like, no, like, she did the braver thing than me, and just said, okay, like, if this is genuinely how you feel, then like, you don't need to be with me anymore. And so she cut off ties, in all honesty, just because she had more courage than I did at that time to do it, because it is what needed to happen. Looking back at the time, I was really mad about, oh, how dare she, blah, blah, like we could have worked it out and everything. But now looking back, I'm like, no, like she just did what I just didn't have it in me to do for whatever reason, because I was still trying to make that work, to make that thing be the thing that was going to make me happy and all that stuff. And until I let it go a couple months later and was able to work through all my stuff, that's when I was like, bam. So
obviously we live in a society that is a lot more open and accepting than it was even 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
But I have no doubts that there are still young Christian kids who are struggling with these things,
mm-hmm.
and worrying about what the God they believe in thinks of them, what their community thinks of them, what would happen to them if someone found out that they found out who they were.
Mm-hmm.
If imagine you're talking to one of those kids now, what do you say?
Ooh. I would probably say very little. Reasoning being is due to that being such a big thing. I feel like it's super easy to overwhelm people with information. The biggest thing that helped me in this whole situation was that I had people like you and like other friends that I could trust to have very private conversations with. So essential to have at least one or two, if not a handful or more, of people that you can just confide in fully without worrying about judgment. So find someone. It doesn't have to be like a relative or a friend. Like, build trust with someone so that they don't have malicious intent, and then be able to have those open conversations, because you're never going to be able to figure it out and where you're at and how you feel and the best way to go about things by yourself. And that's what I tried to do for 14, 15 years, and it failed miserably. So like, definitely I would just say, do you have someone that you can trust, or someone that you want to try to build trust with, in order to have open and honest conversations, and it be someone that's going to help you figure out where you're going to go in it, not guide you like, here, take my hand, I'm going to tell you where to go, but help you figure out for yourself, what is going to be right and best for you. So that would probably be, find that one person, and then find several more of them, and then several more of them. Get as many of them as you can.
John's story is a difficult one, but he's out now. He doesn't believe in God anymore, and he says both of those things have made him happier. There is a second part to the episode with a story from another friend of mine who is still in the closet as a Christian. If you want to hear the rest of the episode, it's available right now at patreon.com/query. And if you decide to become a patron, you'll get instant access to episode 2 as well. The first 3 episodes will post to iTunes and everywhere else May 22nd. I'm beyond excited about this project, and I hope you get as much out of listening as I've gotten out of making it. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist. And
Callie!
Whoa.
This weekend
Dang,
is Mother's Day.
That was aggressive.
Yeah, I'm really aggressive about Mother's Day. You know, I don't know if you had the same experience, but when I was in elementary school and Mother's Day was coming up, they would have us do these like acrostic things where you would write out mother or your mom's first name, and then each letter would stand for something, and you would do it on a heart with lace and give it to your mom for Mother's Day.
I have a bad feeling about this.
You should have a great feeling about this, because I wrote one for our podcast, because this podcast is my family.
Oh, okay.
So I want to let you know what the Gay Theist Manifesto means to me in the form of an acrostic.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually have a really good feeling about this. I thought you were going a different direction with that.
Oh, what did you think was going to happen there?
I thought you had written one for your mom.
Oh, no, that would be way too dark and serious.
Right.
This is a happy show.
Okay, good. Yeah, happy.
Where people are losing their health care. All right, so G is for gay, super duper gay with a big old wiener in the butt. A is for restillman4@gmail.com, my email address, which is free and open to all, especially those with memes, cat pictures, and penis pills to mong, or whatever the verb form of monger is. Y is for why does Callie keep letting me do these? Nobody knows. T is for technically atheism is simply the lack of belief in any of the gods which have been proposed, not a positive claim of the non-existence of any gods. And agnosticism refers to knowledge, although of course certainty is always a sliding scale, and many argue that 100% certainty of any belief or knowledge claim is inherently an untenable position. H is for heckin' friend me on Facebook, because that's the best way to interact with me. And I promise you, I am not a celebrity, and I don't even have 1,000 friends, and the limit is 5,000 friends. So don't be shy. Add me on Facebook. It's sometimes depressing, but sometimes it's funny too. It's just like life. E is for every time we touch, I get this feeling. Every time we kiss, I swear I can fly. I is for intense sensations of validity, belonging, and self-acceptance. Aww.
Oh, that makes me feel good
S
inside.
is for the SJW circle jerk, that abomination against podcasting, which will give you none of the feelings I mentioned in the previous letter. And T is for trans, super duper trans with a big old wiener in the butt. And all together, that spells gay theist. Happy Mother's Day, Gay Theist Manifesto. Ho, ho, ho. Turtles for everybody.
Oh, my God. Ari broke me. Oh, my God.
All right, back to the outro, Callie.
Yeah, God, wow. Yeah, so if you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/The Gay Theist Manifesto and make a per episode donation to support the show. And if that's not something you can do, you can always head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That always helps us get heard by more people. Before you go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gay Theist Manifesto.